Gwen Hobson and Pam Roberts have worked at Manchester High since the 1980s, and they shared the running of the Modern Languages Department for many years. In 2008, they became assistant heads. Pam became director of sixth form, and Gwen was director of co-curriculum. In this role, she was responsible for organising major school events, and she used the archive extensively to prepare films and presentations on aspects of the school's history. Gwen and Pam both retired as assistant heads in December 2014, but in March 2017, when the school archivist, Dr. Christine Joy, retired, they were asked to take over as part-time archivists, as they'd been at the school for so long and knew it so well. So we hope that you will enjoy our conversation this evening. Please do feel free to ask questions through the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and I will be tracking this throughout this evening and using your questions to pose more questions to our archivists. So please do type them in. We'll have a break for your questions halfway through and again at the end. So Gwen and Pam, 150 years. The archive has really come into its own this year. And I wonder if you could start by telling us what we've been doing to remember the history of the school.
Well, hello everybody, and I think the best place to start is with Founders Day.
Yes, so before the formal ceremony started, we watched a film that we made last year about the events leading up to the opening of the school. And it describes the educational landscape in the mid-19th century and explains why Manchester High was founded in 1874. We know that someone has sent in a question about this already.
So there was a growing demand at the time to give girls the same educational opportunities as were given to boys, and to ensure that they had the academic qualifications required to go to university. There was a grassroots, if you like, movement in Manchester, led in the first instance by the Manchester Board of Schoolmistresses to improve the quality of education for governesses.
And at the same time, a series of reports, including the Taunton Commission in 1869, identified the fact that the distribution of schools was uneven, they varied in quality, and the provision for girls was particularly limited. So our film shows what the vision of our founders was and how they went about planning for the opening of the school. It describes the search for premises, the difficulties of recruiting suitably qualified staff, and the campaigns to recruit pupils. So in case you haven't seen it, we will send out a link to everyone after this event, so you can watch that at your leisure. It's a good story.
During the ceremony, the girls gave a presentation describing what happened on the very first day, the 19th of January, 1874. We based this on archive material because we have a description written by pupils who were there for that very first entrance examination. This first day was quite challenging for the 60 girls who were there, because many of them had been taught by governesses at home or in very small private schools, and they weren't used to being with so many other girls all at once.
Yes, the description was written by Frances Harrison and her sister Elizabeth. Frances, or Fanny Harrison, is a high school legend. Not only was she one of the first cohort in 1874, but she also went on to teach in prep, and she later became head of prep. And after her retirement, she was the one who sent ivy leaves from her garden in Sussex by train to the high school so that girls could wear an ivy leaf on Founders Day. And the Harrison lawn outside the East Wing is named after her, as is the fiction library, which was originally the junior library.
We were also able to share a film about a Year 7, or in other words, upper third, archive project done in collaboration with the History Department. The Year 7s looked at early admission forms and plotted addresses on a map to compare the catchment area in 1874 with today's.
So in 1874, most addresses were clustered around school, because it was in what was then a fashionable area. although like today, there were girls living further afield. And the Year 7s also looked at the popularity of first names and found out that the top girls' names at the time were Mary, Emily and Annie.
The Year 7s were fascinated by the fathers' occupations listed on the admissions forms. They were a bit baffled because so many of them no longer exist, and there were some unusual occupations that they had to look up. One father was a wax chandler making wax candles, and another was a tallow chandler manufacturing cheaper candles out of animal fat.
And of course, many fathers were doctors and lawyers or employed in some way in the cotton industry. But the girls quickly realised that the mothers' occupations were not required on the admissions forms, and they were only mentioned if the mother was a widow.
So they were very disappointed that they didn't see Emmeline Pankhurst's signature on the admissions forms of her three daughters, Christabel, Sylvia and Adela, because of course the husband was the head of the household and it was Richard Pankhurst who signed the forms.
Yeah, the other thing that they found very interesting was that religious education wasn't compulsory in the early days, and parents had to sign on the admissions form to opt in to RE lessons for their daughters. And this is very important for Manchester High because the founders were determined from the very beginning that the school should be open to girls of all religions or none, and to girls of all social classes. And this guiding principle is still with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. And Founders Day was such a special occasion. It was wonderful this year. The music was particularly wonderful. Our director of music composed a song for the combined senior and prep school choirs called Spirit of the Times, which took us on a whistle-stop tour, didn't it? Through our founders from their initial meeting in Manchester Town Hall to a reflection on their legacy. We had a dance sequence starting with a stately Victorian dance lesson based on a description in the archive and ending with a rather more energetic street dance from today that the girls loved. So we moved from the past to the present and ended the ceremony with a vision of the future from our very, very engaging prep girls. It was so lovely. It was a fabulous morning.
Yes, and for us as ex-teachers, the most rewarding thing is working with our current pupils and staff and sharing the stories with them. So the Back in Time at School Day, which we held on the 23rd of February, was another memorable day. And this was the brainchild of Jenny Hodson, the academic deputy. And it was a brilliant idea. And it was a fantastic way of bringing the past to life using the archive material.
Yeah, it was incredible fun, wasn't it? Can you tell us just how it was organised? Because it took some time, didn't it?
It did, yes.
Yeah, the planning really started last summer. We had meetings with heads of department and we showed them textbooks and exercise books and exam papers for their subject from across the decades that we hold in the collection. We are so lucky to have a rich collection in the archive. And from this, they each chose material that they could use to create a lesson from the past for their department.
So our head of biology, for example, she could barely contain her excitement when we showed her some botanical drawings and a botany homework notebook from 1909. And these belonged to Margaret Pilkington, who wasn't actually a pupil. She was the sister of our former chair of governors, Dorothy Pilkington, and she was a talented artist who studied at the Slade School of Fine Art. And Dorothy Pilkington donated her sister's notebook and several boxes of her beautifully detailed watercolour paintings of flowers and plants to the archive.
And the head of biology was so thrilled, she was to be levitating with excitement by the exquisite detail and the precise labelling on the drawings. This is something that is no longer taught below undergraduate level, but it was just perfect for the Back in Time lesson. So using scanned copies of the originals, the biology department produced their own version of a botany notebook with space for drawings. And we've seen some of them. The results were quite impressive, and they make a lovely souvenir for the girls.
Yeah. As for maths, well, they chose to do battle with calculations in pounds, shillings and pence, using examples, again, from old exam papers and old textbooks. And by now, of course, we are among the very, very few members of staff who remember old money and the old exercise books with imperial weights and measures on the back. And some of you may remember them. And so we found ourselves in the unusual situation of having to explain how old money worked to younger colleagues. And it made us also feel quite clever because we had to explain it to the maths department. But we did feel very old.
And for PE, we looked at some photos of early calisthenics lessons. So calisthenics was the Victorian equivalent of gym. And in particular, we have a lovely photo taken in 1905 of girls dancing round a maypole in the playground at Dover Street. So the PE department managed to acquire a maypole, and now we have wonderful equivalent photos of current pupils dancing round the maypole in the same way.
In colour.
In colour.
Yeah. In colour, yeah. I must admit, though, I didn't actually expect to see girls disappearing down the corridor with tins of Brasso and darning mushrooms. What on earth was all that about?
Well, that's because Sarah Burstall, the second headmistress, introduced a housewifery course at Manchester High, which ran from 1899 to 1919. And although we were primarily an academic school, the reality was that not all girls could go to university for a variety of reasons, and some had to run the home after they left school. So we often find in early records that the leaving destination is home duties.
So the housewifery course was intended to equip the girls in the housewifery stream in the sixth form for this eventuality. It was modelled on courses that Sarah Burstall had seen on a tour she made of American schools. We have a copy of the syllabus in the archive, and we have to say, I mean, the curriculum was very detailed, very rigorous and scientific, and very wide-ranging.
Yes, there was cookery, of course, including invalid cookery, but it also covered laundry, i.e. washing, ironing, starching, if anybody does that today, hygiene, physiology, dressmaking, keeping household and bank accounts, domestic architecture and garden design, and the management of servants.
Chance to be a fine thing, eh? So, but some of the activities that the girls did on Back in Time Day were based on this syllabus. And Jenny Hodson also used a copy of Mrs. Beaton's Book of Household Management as a source of information. So they tried napkin folding, darning and cleaning cutlery with the Brasso.
Yeah, they also did some cookery and some embroidery of the sort that you see on samplers, because we have an example of a sampler from 1888 in the archive, which inspired the head of home economics. So the girls had a go at embroidering ivy leaves in cross stitch.
I think they had an amazing time just
yeah.
Looking at the curriculum from the past. What about extracurricular activities? What did they do from the past in terms of extracurricular activities?
Well, there were games, simple games like skipping, hopscotch, tiddlywinks. And I think the girls really, and looking at the photographs, the girls really enjoyed those. And we also found clubs that were listed in old school magazines. There was a calligraphy club and the Square Record Society, which seems like a strange concept, but it entailed listening to records whilst knitting squares to make blankets for charity. So somebody managed to resurrect some LPs, or I think the girls call them vinyls nowadays, and a turntable, just so to get really in the mood.
Yeah. And we should also mention that the lunch served on the day was based on menus from the past, and we must thank the old girls who responded to our plea for suggestions. We remember food from our own school days long ago, not always with affection, so we chose dishes that would be acceptable to a modern clientele, such as toad in the hole, the classic and the vegetarian versions, macaroni cheese, bubble and squeak, and chocolate sponge with chocolate custard. And there was also a taster table with less popular delicacies so that the brave ones could sample them. There were dishes such as prunes and custard, spam fritters, and liver and onions. Yeah.
But we drew the line at Sago and semolina because we both hated those.
Yeah. In the archive, we have photos of the dining room in the 1950s with tables for 6 laid out for lunch with cutlery and glasses. And some of you may remember the older girls serving out the food at their table from large containers. So the canteen staff set out some tables like this in the dining room so they had the full immersive experience.
Yeah, the girls asked if that could be a daily occurrence. But the tuck shop was a real hit as well, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean, you and Jenny managed to get hold of some old money, old-fashioned sweets. So the girls were given 4 old pence to spend on such delights as sugar mice, double lollies, pineapple chunks. There were mint imperials, aniseed balls. And yeah, and you managed to get some paper bags, some little paper bags with the 150th logo. And I think they loved that.
Yeah, I think they absolutely loved it. And we're really, really grateful to the PTA because they helped us do that, and they funded the tuck shop experience and helped us a lot. So it was a wonderful community effort. The staff really got into the spirit of it, and the Victorian costumes and costumes from other decades just were fantastic. Staff loved it. We've got some amazing records of the day, and there are some fantastic photographs. I hope people have seen them on the school social media channels and Flickr, if people do want to have a look, because it was a very, very special day.
Yes, and we were really pleased that material from the archive finally saw the light of day and was put to such good use. We're looking at it all the time, which is great, but other people need to have the chance.
Yeah.
And we realise that we're sitting on a treasure trove.
Yes, and we're so grateful to all the old girls who donated their school books, the artifacts and other documents to the archive. And there is definitely a PhD in there for someone who wants to trace the evolution of teaching and learning across the decades. And in fact, we've already supplied material for 2 PhD researchers, one looking at the House-Wifry syllabus and another looking at the curriculum and extracurricular activities in the interwar years.
Amazing. We've actually got a message in the chat which from Judith, who said we did actually dance around a maypole at prep at Broomfield in 1916. It was made from a netball net. So yes. Yeah, so there are memories about the maypole. The girls love that. And talking about prep, you've been doing an awful lot of work with prep as well, haven't you?
Yes, we've supported the prep department, who've organised a great project aimed at discovering aspects of the school's history as part of their 150th birthday celebrations. So each year group has been given a story from the archive to explore using primary materials from our collection. And the documentation has been used as a stimulus for written work and artwork, and it will culminate in a piece of drama from each class.
So we've selected stories that they can relate to. So Year 4, for example, have been investigating the boarding house chronicle. You might not know that the school had its own boarding house. It was situated at 1 Addison Terrace in Victoria Park from 1899 to about 1903. So Addison Terrace was just round the corner from the school in Dover Street.
And it was needed at that time because there were so few academic schools for girls. Remember that Manchester High was the first school in the north to offer this kind of education, and parents from much further away wanted to send their daughters to us. So it was overseen by Miss Alice Shannon. She was a modern languages teacher. For some reason, the boarding house was known as the Rabbit Hutch, and Miss Shannon herself had the nickname Shannibus.
Yes. So the Boarding House Chronicle was actually written by some of the girls who lived there from 1901 to 1902. One of the authors was Muriel Alice Bedson. She was a pupil at Manchester High from 1900 to 1905. and the other was Constance May Gill, who was a pupil from 1900 to 1902. And Muriel went on to study French and German at the University of Manchester and was later a member of the teaching staff from 1909 to 1910. And Constance became a Red Cross radiographer.
And the chronicle is in the form of an album with an embroidered cover. It's quite fragile now, but we have an original handwritten copy in the archive as well as a transcript. And the girls, the boarding house girls, obviously wanted to keep their memories of the many events that occurred during their stay at the boarding house.
Yes, and the pranks of the boarders feature very heavily. There's a lovely description of a midnight strawberry feast when the girls used 5 old pennies of their milk money to buy a pound of strawberries, a pot of cream and some sugar.
And then they turned a drawer upside down in their dormitory to make a table, covered it with a spotlessly white cloth, in other words, Muriel's towel, and they used soap dishes as bowls for the strawberries.
Yes, they admit that they felt quite sick afterwards. And of course, the prep girls just love it because it reminds them of Mallory Towers and Hogwarts. And,
yeah, it's just up their street.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I'd love to read that. Clearly, sense of humour among girls has not changed that much since over the last 150 years.
Yeah, well, you will be able to read it, then we'll tell you how later. We have a cunning plan.
Excellent. Can't wait. So what else have the prep been exploring?
Well, even the reception class, year 1, are involved. We have prep form photographs in the archive from 1899, and we can identify the children in them because there were form lists in the annual school reports, and we found out more about each one of them from their admissions forms.
So the reception classes are each recreating one of these photos, and they're going to tell us about the people in the picture, who they are, where they lived, what their fathers did. So one of the fathers, for example, was Mr. Thewlis, and he was the Lord Mayor of Manchester.
Yes, and it's interesting because in the photos, the children are all holding toys, and we've explained to the girls that this is because the exposure time for the photograph was so long that they needed something to help them keep still. And if you look closely, you can see that the members of staff in the photo are very discreetly holding the shoulders of the wrigglier pupils to stop them from fidgeting.
And there are boys in the photos as well as girls. They were admitted to prep if their sisters were in school. They all look very solemn because it's impossible to hold a smile for the length of time that it would take to take the photograph. So a serious expression is something that's much easier to hold.
Yeah. And as you might expect, one of the year groups is tackling the suffragettes and the suffragists, and the year 6 groups chose to look at the evacuation from Dover Street and the aftermath of the bombing of Grangethorpe.
Amazing. I've been into a few lessons and they're really, really enjoying it. And what they're producing is really brilliant. I can't wait to see the end result. And but what you've just said does bring me to 2 questions that have been sent in. And I'm really looking forward to the answer to this one. Firstly, boys. So when exactly did we have boys at Manchester High School for girls?
Well, there were 2 waves. Firstly, from 1881 to 1909, we accepted boys from 6 to 9 who had sisters in school. 2 of the boys were killed during the First World War, and their deaths were reported in the school magazine.
Yeah, and the second wave was from 1940 to 1949. We inherited boys from the private prep schools, which we took over after the bombing of Grangethorpe when we needed temporary premises. And we also took in 3 refugee boys in 1941.
Wow. And this relates to another of the questions that we've received in advance. Could you explain the precise order of events at the beginning of the war? Where were we when war actually broke out?
Well, in 1939, Manchester High wasn't here at Grangethorpe Road. It was still in its second home in Dover Street. So it's much nearer the centre of Manchester.
Yes, by 1939, we have to say Dover Street was much too small. And so the governors had already bought the Grangethorpe site, and work was already underway to convert what had been the Grangethorpe Military Hospital into a school.
But going back to Dover Street, the Manchester Education Committee decided that if there was a war, children should be evacuated from the city centre and from areas which were more likely to be bombed. So Dover Street was quite close to factories, canals and railway stations, quite dangerous. So it was decided that it would be safer to move the school further out of town.
Yeah, so it was just like the situation at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. Well before war was declared in September 1939, Dr. Clark, the headmistress, reported to governors that parents were contacting school anxious for information about what was going to happen to their daughters in the event of war.
So parents' evenings were held to discuss the plans and to explain that Manchester High would be participating in the government scheme for the evacuation of children. By July 1939, just before the summer holidays, a letter was sent to parents telling them exactly what would happen if school had to be evacuated.
So in the archive, we have copies of the instructions to parents, the list of kit needed by each girl, and even one of the identification tags issued to the children. And of course, they needed a gas mask in a named container. And we know from the documents that the school had an official number, which was 375.
Yeah, and that had to be on all the identification material.
Yeah.
The evacuation took place on the 2nd of September, so the day before war was declared. The girls gathered in school and were evacuated from there with their teachers. What they didn't know at the time was that the school would never again return to Dover Street.
Yeah. So the girls had to walk in a crocodile, carrying their rucksacks to London Road Station, which is now Piccadilly Station. And Dr. Clark admitted later that she led the procession, carrying her own suitcase to encourage the girls. But what the girls didn't know was that the suitcase was empty and her luggage was sent later by car because of her age. She was actually 58 years old and close to retirement by then, and she didn't feel able to carry a heavy suitcase.
And the girls were put on a train to an unknown destination, which turned out to be Gatley. And they then transferred onto a bus to Cheadle-Hulme. And the billeting officers arranged for the girls to be allocated to families. Cheadle-Hulme School took us in, and the next day, on the 3rd of September, the staff heard the declaration of war on the radio.
So how on earth did that work?
Well, it was very difficult for everybody, but they had no choice. They made the best of it. They had a shift system for lessons. Cheadle-Hulme used the buildings in the morning, and we used them in the afternoon. And other buildings in Cheadle-Hulme were pressed into service. And so we have a photograph of an art lesson taking place above Monkhouse's shop.
The sixth forms were amalgamated, so the older girls had their first experience of co-education, and Dr. Clark wrote in her autobiography that she thought that co-education worked well after the age of 16 because neither the boys nor the girls found the presence of the opposite sex emotionally disturbing at that stage.
However, it was different for the younger girls in lower forms who were apparently tiresome in their pursuit of the sixth form boys. Something's never changed.
Obviously, many girls miss their parents. So we know this from accounts that we've got in the archive, first-hand accounts, and some went home for the weekend. In the end, they hadn't travelled very far. Some parents decided that their daughters could come back home to live, but travel to Cheadle-Hulme for school every day, often on their bikes. So you could say that the evacuation was partial.
Yes, in fact, we only stayed in Cheadle-Hulme for a year. Because by September 1940, the new school in Grangethorpe Road was ready for us to move in.
And then, in a cruel twist of fate, the new school was bombed in December 1940. and we had to move out again, this time to various rented buildings in Didsbury. Many old girls remember their time at Broomfield, Worley and Central Road.
That's interesting, because we've already heard about Broomfield already this evening. So can we just hear a little bit more about those places then? Because so many of our alumni talk about their time there with such great affection. I so often hear them talking about Broomfield. You've heard about Broomfield already on the chat. So yeah, if you could tell us a little bit more, that would be great.
Yeah. I mean, Broomfield, Worley and Central Road were the three buildings used to house the school after the Grangethorpe Road building was bombed in December 1940.
Yeah, so if we
take them one by one.
Broomfield first. Before 1940, Broomfield had been a prep school run by a Miss Lancashire. And by 1941, it was still a prep school for children aged 4 to 8, including boys. So in January 1941, when we were made homeless after the bombing, we leased Broomfield from the owner, who was then Miss Kathleen Farley Wright. And we took on the existing pupils, including the boys. And Miss Wright continued to live on the top floor.
Not sure that would be
sure that it would be acceptable today. No, maybe not.
Broomfield was small. It was much too small. There wasn't a dining room. The heating system was inadequate by all accounts, and the kitchens were freezing. It seems quite alarming to us today, but they had to install gas fires on the second floor because of the problems of maintaining coal fires. And because it was wartime, they had to strengthen the cellars to provide air raid shelters, and they had to organise voluntary fire watching, which was undertaken by most of the staff, some parents and some governors.
And because there was no dining room, the school rented the garage belonging to a neighbour, Mr. Behrens. But eventually, naturally, he wanted his garage back. So the girls had to eat in the gym or even outside in fine weather. But this led to another problem, because the grand piano, which was used for singing lessons, had to be moved out of the gym. And the governor's minutes of July 1946 report that singing lessons would have to be held in St. Aidan's Church instead of in the gym. And this might cause problems, because another neighbour had said he'd suffered such annoyance from the school that he might take legal action. So, yeah.
But to end the story, Broomfield was demolished in 1975. It's now flats. But in 2020, an old girl sent us a photo of the gate post with the name of the house engraved on it. And her father had rescued it from the skip at the time of demolition, and it now has pride of place in her garden.
The second building was Worley, and that was on Spath Road in Didsbury. And this too had been a private prep school, and it was leased from the owner, Mrs. Moser. And again, the accommodation wasn't ideal. There weren't enough toilets, and they had to use wash basins and fittings that they salvaged from the bombed Grangethorpe building.
And here too, neighbours complained about the sound of piano playing emanating from the school, but the children seemed to have enjoyed it enormously. There was a lovely garden with 2 lawns.
Yes, and there were dens, which the boys used for their headquarters, and the girls played houses or hospitals or schools. And the best den was among the rhododendron bushes, where some of the branches apparently were shaped like chairs. And apparently the trees were beautiful, and there were garden seats where the children sat when it was hot. And there was also a dog called Paddy.
So this explains why we had the second wave of boys. We inherited both from the prep schools that we'd leased. Central Road was the third building. It had been bought by Manchester Grammar School as a prep school, and we leased it from MGS. It was the only building with science labs. It had a hut for a dining room, but there was no running hot water. Benches were used because they took up less room than chairs.
It did have 2 partitioned classrooms which could be opened up and used for assembly. And the house next door, which was 80 Central Road, had a staff room with a couch. And this became the medical room, and the deputy head had her desk in the corner. But there was no headmistress's room. And so Dr. Clark had to sit on a bench in the staff cloakroom if she wanted to talk to anyone privately.
Yeah, and the other problem was that Central Road was a 10-minute car ride from Broomfield and Worley. And so the governors had to apply for Dr. Clark to have extra petrol rations in order to get from one building to another.
Yeah. So after the war, there was a phased return from these three places to Grangethorpe. The fifths, the upper fifths and the sixth form returned in September 1949, and the rest of the senior school returned in 1951. But Prep didn't return from Broomfield until 1973, and that's why so many people still remember it.
Gosh, I mean, I can't imagine what it must have been like for a headmistress to run a school in those circumstances. It's an extraordinary achievement.
Yes, and that's why the chair of governors, Dorothy Pilkington, asked Mitzi Cunliffe, the American sculptor, to design Threshold, the low relief sculpture over the old main door. And it was to recognise the courageous leadership of Dr. Clark and her staff in a lasting way.
We know that a lot of people used to pass this every day without knowing why it was there. And we know there's been a question from the audience about it. So briefly, Mitzi Cunliffe's two daughters were pupils at Manchester High. She is more famous for designing the BAFTA mask, but there's a lot of her work around Manchester on buildings similar to ours. And we're proud to be part of the Mitzi Cunliffe Trail. And we're planning to make a short film about the sculpture. So you'll hear more about that soon. The symbolism of the sculpture is quite interesting, but it's quite intricate and would probably be better suited to a film, I think.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And while we're on the subject of the sculpture, can you tell us a bit about the conservation work that is planned to ensure that it will be safe for generations to come?
Yes, so the issue of conservation was raised by one of our governors, who's also an architect. The sculpture has been in position since 1953, so we really needed to have it inspected by conservation experts. In the archive, we have detailed notes on the symbolism behind the sculpture, and we know that it's made of Portland stone, but we have absolutely no information on how it's fixed to the wall.
So we needed to check that it was safe and whether it needed any conservation work. And we contacted a specialist company who came to inspect the sculpture at close quarters. And we're pleased to report that it is in pretty good condition generally. The fixings are very secure. That was worrying us. And they have now been mapped using a metal detector for future reference.
And the stone is relatively clean, apart from a few areas where water has gathered, but it isn't serious and it can be cleaned. There's one small fissure in the surface that can be filled, and there are a few splashes of mortar which can be scraped off using a scalpel. So we're very relieved that there's no really urgent remedial work that needs to be done, but the minor repairs will be carried out.
Fantastic. And on the issue of conservation, what about the conservation of the Sarah Burstall tapestry?
All 126,000 is of it. Yeah, the tapestry was made by Sarah Burstall, the second headmistress, after she retired, and she donated it to school. And it shows a peacock on a wall with ivy leaves. It was made into a fire screen, and we remember it standing in front of the fireplace in the staff room at Grangethorpe.
And then when the staff room was refurbished, it disappeared into the cellar. And it didn't resurface until 2022, when we found it in a very sorry state with a broken frame and heavily stained with nicotine, because back in the day, members of staff were allowed to smoke in the staff room.
So it's now with the Conservation Department of the People's History Museum in Manchester. They specialise in textiles. And they said that it was in relatively good condition considering its age. So they're in the process of cleaning it and reframing it. And we look forward to welcoming it back in November and exhibiting it then.
Yeah, can't wait to see it again. Now, the archive has been used so much in school this year, but I wonder, are you still receiving a lot of external inquiries?
Oh yes, they come in waves, but easily 5 or 6 a month and often more. So it's a combination of academic inquiries and family history research. And sometimes they're quite unexpected, but researching the answers always teaches us a bit more about the school's history. For example, recently, a PhD student from Manchester contacted us about early women chemists from Manchester High.
One of them was Molly Brewis, a pupil from 1918 to 1927, and she took her chemistry degree at Manchester in 1930. She went on to organise wartime nurseries in the Northwest during the Second World War. And in fact, when we researched her, when she was at school, she was the organiser of the Babies Hospital Auxiliary Society, which raised funds and collected toys and clothes for the children. The Babies Hospital was co-founded by our school doctor, Catherine Chisholm. So it's nice to think that Molly's early experience at school might have influenced her future career path.
And the other chemist we've been looking at was Lucy Higginbottom, who was a pupil from 1913 to 1915, and she gained a first-class degree in chemistry in 1919 and was awarded the Leblanc Medal for Chemistry for her research into cotton. And this was a remarkable achievement because so few women were studying maths and the sciences at the time, and even fewer would achieve medal status.
And while we were researching early women graduates of Manchester University, we were struck by the number of Manchester High girls who were at the forefront of university education for women. What's really interesting is the fact that Manchester High was seen from the beginning as a great feeder for the women's department of Owens College, now the University of Manchester. And in fact, early lectures for women, particularly for science teaching, were held at the high school in Dover Street. And there was also a refectory for the women there. So this is an area where we need to do more research, and we will report back.
Yeah. And there are two other inquiries which we weren't expecting this year. And the first came from Robinson's Brewery in Stockport. Would we like our book back? And as you can imagine, we were a bit baffled by this. But the book turned out to be the agenda book for the governing body from 1883. And it's a beautiful leather-bound ledger with marbled edges to the pages, containing handwritten notes taken by the secretary or the clerk to the governors at governors' meetings, we assume. And the newly appointed archivist to the brewery had found the book in the depths of one of their brewery rooms.
So off we went to Robinson's to reclaim our lost property, and the ledger contains rough notes for the formal minutes, which we hold in the archive, including details of discussion about the headmistress's salary. And we can now compare the two volumes and see how the secretary has crossed out the notes once they've been formally written up in the minute book. It also explains why in the early minutes, which are handwritten, there are rarely any crossings out. They are works of art.
Yes, they're beautiful, absolutely beautiful. But we have absolutely no idea how the book came to be there, nor has anyone at Robinson's, because we can't find any officers in common. So if ever we solve the mystery, we let you know. And if anybody has any ideas, please send in your suggestions.
And the second unusual inquiry came from you, Helen, before building work was done in the summer holidays.
Yes, indeed. The architect and the unexploded bomb survey. Our architect had done his research. He knew that the site had suffered bomb damage in 1940, and he wondered if we had any photos or plans of the bombing to help with the survey.
Yes, and we knew that we had photos. You've got fabulous photos, but we also remembered that we had a map which showed plat fields and the school site and the location of the bombs that had fallen in the area. So we scanned the map for the architect, but we were quite surprised by just how many bombs had fallen in the area.
Yes, and it never ceases to amaze us what curious but useful items we have in the collection. And sometimes we stumble across really interesting snippets when we're researching something else. So only yesterday, for example, we discovered that in 1899, Miss Burstall arranged for a private omnibus to take pupils from London Road Station to the school every morning at a charge of £1 per week. So that means that the city centre shuttle buses, which we run today to school from the 3 main stations in Manchester, are not as groundbreaking as we thought when we introduced them about 11 years ago, because Miss Burstall had the idea first.
Amazing. That's so brilliant. And am I right in thinking that you have a rather cunning plan to give people a chance to see some of these treasures?
Yes, we do. We really want to show them off. So on June the 30th, we will be doing our annual walking tour in school, but this year it will be a little bit different.
Yeah, so we will walk a very short distance to look at key artworks in school, such as the Mitzi Cunliffe sculpture, the Sylvia Pankhurst bronzes, and the Jacob Epstein bronze in the headmistress's office. But the main focus will be a guided exhibition of interesting and unusual items from the collection. So, for example,
early applications forms, early governor's minutes, the Pankhurst sisters admissions form, letters, telegrams, photographs, as well as artifacts.
Yes, and there'll also be a chance to look at textbooks and exam papers and written work from past decades. So it might be worth saving the date in your diary.
Yeah, absolutely. June the 30th. June the 30th.
That's it.
So many thanks for that. We've got lots of questions coming in, and please do add any questions that you do have in the chat, please. So let me get through some of these now. So we've had a question about uniform. Do you know who introduced the divided skirt to the uniform of the 1960s and why?
According to our archive records, the divided skirt came in after the war when Miss Bosman was headmistress. Obviously, during the war, uniform regulations were suspended because of the difficulties of clothing coupons, rationing, supply problems. The divided skirt appears on the 1958 uniform list as an alternative to the regulation black skirt, but it was only for upper third, fourth and upper fourth form, so years 7 to 9.
Yeah, but the regulation divided skirt was part of the PE kit, so it was probably introduced because it was modest, it was good for PE, and maybe it was thought, well, okay, you could, to save money, maybe it could be used as uniform for the lower forms as well. We're not sure. We have no information about why it was introduced. We just know that it was there. But during the 1960s, under Miss Cottrell, the divided skirt disappeared. We can't pinpoint the exact date from the records we have. So again, if anyone can help us with that, we would love to know.
Yeah, and one of tonight's audience has also asked if we have any information on Grangethorpe Hospital.
Yes, we do. So Manchester High now stands on the site of Grangethorpe House, which was originally built in 1882 for the Moseley family. And in about 1915, one of our founders, Edward Donner, was a member of the hospital committee, which raised £1,000 to buy Grangethorpe House for use by wounded servicemen.
Yeah, and then in 1917, Grangethorpe Hospital was built in the grounds of Grangethorpe House. The grounds were enormous. They went all the way down from Wilmslow Road down to Platt.
Yes, it's an 11-acre site.
Yes, it's huge. And because the Ministry of War needed an orthopaedic hospital in Manchester, so they built 6 wards, an operating theatre, a gym, an administrative block, nurses' accommodation at Grangethorpe.
And pioneering work was done there in the reconstruction of damaged nerves, tendon transplants and bone grafts. But by the 1930s, the hospital was no longer needed. It stood empty. And that's why the site was bought by the governors, so that they could convert the hospital into the new school, which, as we now know, was bombed in 1940. And we do have a wonderful set of photos from the hospital in the archive, which will be on show at our June event.
And actually, we also have a photo taken in, I think it's 1937, of some girls having an art lesson in the grounds of Grangethorpe House. So they must have been taken down from Dover Street to Grangethorpe House, and they're sitting on camp chairs in the garden, absolutely engrossed in their drawings, aren't they? That's a good photo too.
Amazing. Can't wait to see all of these in June. We've had quite a few questions through, so if you don't mind me asking you some more, put you on the right, see how you cope with some of these. But I love this question because I know that you've already made a video about it, but if you could summarize it for us. So Lisa asks about the link to the Ivy Leaf prior to what you said about Fanny Harrison sending them for pupils to wear on Founders Day, and I love this story. We'll talk about it today.
Yes. Yes, we did make a film about it, and we'll send out a link to that film when the recording of the talk is sent out. Yes, so yes, we didn't have a school logo until, well, I think it's the late 1890s, wasn't it? They by then, Manchester High wasn't the only school for girls. We had competition.
And we needed an identity.
Yes,
we needed a brand.
We needed a brand. I mean, there is nothing new under the sun. So there was, the girls were asked to suggest a logo for the school, weren't they? A badge for the school.
Initially, it started out for sport. So the hockey club were the first people to use it. So if girls
chose this Ivy League, didn't they?
And it was designed by Ethel Greengrass of the Senior Six.
That's right. And because it stands for faithfulness,
loyalty,
steadfastness,
resilience.
And resilience. Yes, that was why the Ivy Leaf was chosen. And yes, it was worn by the hockey team first. And we have various iterations of the Ivy Leaf throughout the decades in the archive.
So the girls on the hockey team wore it first if they had played in a number, I think it was 5 or 6 matches successfully. They were awarded I think it was the Ivy Leaf in the shield, and it had Manchester
MHSG HC Hockey Club, Manchester High School for Girls Hockey Club.
That's right.
That was it.
So it was initially in sport, and then gradually it was adopted throughout the school, and it became kind of the symbol of the school. And that's why Fanny Harrison would send bunches of it by train from Sussex.
We're not really sure why, because obviously there's ivy everywhere around school and in everybody's gardens, but nonetheless it was a lovely gesture that she sent it up every year.
And for me it's a real symbol of tenacity and everything that a Manchester High pupil is, tenacious and got grit and perseverance. I think it's great. I mean, of course we brought the Ivy Leaf back into the branding in 2021, and I love the fact that often alumni call themselves the Ivies.
They do now. Yes, that's relatively recent, but they call themselves the Ivies, and so they identify with it. It's great.
It's fantastic.
It's also worth pointing out that in the initial, when Manchester High was started, uniform was associated with poverty, and so there was no school uniform. And in fact, Sarah Bursell had tried a couple of times to introduce uniform because she thought it would be a good idea, and met with quite a lot of resistance from parents. So we had the Ivy Leaf badge for the hockey team
first,
and then they chose that they could wear a hat band, and the hat band had to be in the school colours. So it came in very, 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 very gradually.
Yeah, fascinating. We've got a few comments. Helen says there was a maypole in the prep in the mid-1980s as well. And Kathy says that she remembers having imperial weights on exercise books. Not quite old enough to remember much maths in shillings, but she remembers spending them.
Well, we do remember that we were in the junior 6th when decimal currency was introduced in 1971. So we remember it well. That shows how old we are. Sorry.
And a thanks talking about the Mitzi Cunliffe sculpture, because one alumnus says here that nobody was ever told about it. So it's fascinating to hear that. So there's one question from some smaller children. Please, could you tell us a little bit more about the Pankhurst sisters' time at Manchester High?
Right. Yes. Well, the Pankhurst family lived just round the corner from Manchester High. And so it was a natural place for them to come. They weren't here for very long.
Well,
In actual fact,
they had been
to school in Southport, hadn't they? And
yeah.
then they moved to Manchester, and they started at Manchester High, I think in 1893.
So Christabel at that time,
Christabel was the eldest, yes,
and so she qualified for university, so she probably did effectively the sixth form,
yes,
and then went to university and studied
law, and was the first woman to graduate in law from the University of Manchester, and with a first. And apparently the men were so excited when she graduated that they shouted her name, didn't they?
We want Christabel.
We want Christabel, we want Christabel. Yes, so that was Christabel. The second daughter was Sylvia, and she what she loved at Manchester High was art. She really loved her art lessons, and I think actually it was arranged for her to go and have some lessons at the Manchester School of Art. She was so talented.
And she won quite a few prizes as well.
Yes,
travelling scholarships, I think.
She wasn't desperately happy at Manchester High. We have to admit that. If you read her autobiography, she will say that. But nonetheless, she did her talent for art was developed while she was at school.
And then the youngest, Adela, who's probably the one that most people don't remember or sort of falls off the list, with concentrating on Christabel and Sylvia. In fact, Adela was
she enjoyed her time at Manchester High.
She thrived. Wrote masses.
Yes.
During her time, the school magazine is full of her stories and articles. She became editor of the school magazine. She's a prolific writer, but
she had quite a lot. She had time off. She had to leave because she had scarlet fever, didn't she?
Yeah.
So her time at Manchester High was interrupted by scarlet fever. But Emmeline Pankhurst was a supporter of the school and was invited back for important ceremonies like Speech Day and Founders Day. So the link remained, didn't it? And of course, we still have connections with the Pankhurst family today. I mean, we bought the bronzed maquette, the models for a statue of Sylvia Pankhurst, and these little bronzes stand one in reception, one in Helen's office. Richard Pankhurst, who was the son of Sylvia,
is a supporter.
Was a great supporter of the school, and as is Helen.
Yeah.
So the connection goes on.
Yeah. God, talk about that all evening. I must move on. Could you tell us a little bit more, please, about the school zoo?
The school zoo.
Oh, when they moved to Dover Street, they had the opportunity to have labs, and at the time, really, girls were only nice girls only did a little bit of botany. They didn't do any real sort of biology. And Caroline Quanyu, who was the biology teacher at the time, she wanted to introduce biology, and so she did this firstly by having animals, and so they had various animals which they kept in the labs.
Yes, they had newts, they had toads, they had frogs, they had a grass snake, didn't they?
Yes.
Of fabulous length.
Who used to escape from his aquarium and hide behind the wainscoting in the classrooms, and if they got anywhere near him, he would hiss. So he's quite an interesting character. But they also had two cats, didn't they?
They had two cats called Romeo and Juliet, who used to parade round school very majestically.
Like prefects.
Yes, more majestically than the prefects.
More majestic
story. Yes, more majestic prefects.
And two salamanders.
Yes.
So in a way, that was very progressive.
Girls would love that now. And I went to a fantastic Year 2 lesson last week where they were talking about the snake of remarkable length. It was brilliant. Having a fantastic time. Yes. Brilliant, thank you. Kathy says, Everything you've been talking about is exceptionally fascinating, particularly about kind of the decades of the older history of the school. But how are you keeping the archive up to date to ensure recent events over the last 20 to 30 years are retained as history for years to come?
Right. Well, we gather information practically every day. So we have, we log, for example, the winners of prizes.
Mm-hmm.
We keep copies of all programs, so music programs, drama programs, the programs from ceremonies like Founders Day and Speech Day. We keep a record of what is going on chronologically during the year.
Yeah, because we should say our predecessor, Dr. Joy,
Yeah.
Who is responsible really for setting up the archive, she had worked through each year. So we have a Word document for every year, and in that Word document are listed chronologically all the events.
Yeah.
And we find that we go back to these documents time after time after time after time. And so we quickly realized that actually, for the sake of whoever comes after us, we need to do the same. So we did that. It takes up quite a lot of time, but it's a real lifesaver. And for example, during the COVID period, we did log everything chronologically, because at some point somebody is going to say, how on earth did that work? What did they do? When did they go back?
So we have copies of all the letters that were sent out to parents, for example, so you can trace the evolution, what happened, when the lockdowns happened, what sort of measures, hygiene measures were going to be taken. So we try to log as much as we possibly can. I mean, obviously, we have to be careful in terms of data protection. So some information that is being stored now will be closed and won't be made public for at least 110 years, unless we have permission from any people who are mentioned in there. So yes, we are very careful about what we store.
Yeah.
And I remember, certainly, I mean, you do that now, but during COVID, it was very much, Helen, can we have some of your risk assessments? Because as you say, that at the time, even though it was an awful situation, having that as part of the history of the school is very important for the future.
We have to say it's getting harder, partly because of data protection rules.
Yeah.
And
so, for
social
example, in school magazines, we don't have full names of girls anymore. And because of social media, so many things are on social media and are very fleeting. Paper is easy to keep, and it's probably the safest because
it endures.
It endures in the way that different IT formats don't. So these are challenges that all archivists are facing, and in fact, it's the subject that's going to be coming up. We belong to the School Archives and Records Association, which it's a group of people from the major public schools, and people like Eton and Harrow and all the rest. And we meet annually, and we have a conference, and this is one of the topics that will be coming up.
It worries us all.
It worries us all. Yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting. We've got a couple of comments on divided skirts for you. Gillian said 1965 to 1967, end of the tie beret and divided skirt for uniform. And Sheila said, my sister Pam Milgate, I think it's the upper 11, 1964, wore a divided skirt. They'd gone off the uniform list by 1966 when I was in there.
Right, well, that's so really
that fits in them, because that is Miss Cottrell's time, isn't it? So that fits in with what we think. Yes.
What you know, yeah. Question from Farah: do you have copies of all the entrance exams? I did mine 30 years ago this year, and vaguely remember writing an essay about finding a treasure chest.
No, we don't. We don't actually have. We have some entrance exams, but we certainly don't have more recent ones, because they've been kept secret. I'm not quite sure why. It would be lovely to have them, I have to say. I'm not quite sure why we don't now, but
because it does actually
sort of pins the standard, it benchmarks the standard. It would be good to have them in the archive, even if they can't be shared with other people for some time to come. It would be, maybe that's something you could think about, Helen.
We do have
we do
an
have some.
entrance exam. We do have
Yeah.
the scholarship papers from 1948.
They are incredibly difficult, I have to say. They are so hard. You mean you would blench if you saw them.
So yeah, the 1948 ones are quite interesting. So yeah, it's a question of benchmarking, and certainly when we did the exercise, the back in time exercise, and we were going through sets of exercise books with heads of departments, and you were turning over the pages, and heads of department were kind of going, oh gosh,
not sure we could do
not
that.
sure that we could do
not
that.
because the girls are less intelligent or anything like that. It's just that methods have changed so much, and that's what's interesting.
But it's actually quite interesting. It gives you a benchmark. You can look at it and say, well, actually that's because you can see it's a marked piece of work. And some old girls have been wonderful, and they have given us everything from sort of the minute they walked in the door in reception.
So we've got their early handwriting practice all the way through to A-level essays.
Wow.
But that's quite an exciting collection to have.
Fantastic. Sheila says, we did our O-levels in 1971, and we were worried about our exams and whether the money would be in LSD or new pence.
Oh, yes.
That's funny. And Kate says, I remember being editor of A Word in Edgeways, a page for the MGS Mancunian newspaper. Does the Word in Edgeways still exist? This would have been between 1983 and 1985.
I think we've got some examples of that magazine.
I think we do, yes. We'll have to have a look, and we will again, we'll send out, we'll do the research and we'll send out the information. But I think we do.
We do, because we came across them the other day and we thought, why have we got these? And that might be why. So we can do a bit more work.
Yeah, that would be good to see some of Kate's work, I think. And finally, what is your favourite story from the archive?
Oh,
well, it has to be, I think.
It's the Steamboat Ladies. Yes, the Steamboat Ladies is our favourite story. We've told it before, but it's just a wonderful
We never
story.
tire of it.
No.
So Caroline Quanyu, who was the biology mistress we talked about earlier, she describes in the 1905 school magazine how 6 members of the Manchester High staff, including Miss Burstall, the headmistress, became so-called Steamboat Ladies.
Yes, this is because women were barred from formal university degree status at Oxford until 1920 and Cambridge until 1948. That's only 6 years before we were born, even though they had passed their examinations. And Sarah Burstall and Caroline Quanyu had both studied at Cambridge, so they were in that situation. They didn't have a degree.
But there was a curious loophole from 1904 to 1907, and this meant that Oxbridge women students could be granted from degrees from Trinity College, Dublin. So using the fast mail boats, the expedition to Dublin to graduate could be done in 34 hours, hence the name Steamboat Ladies.
So groups of friends from the same graduation year or from the same school would often travel over together to Dublin. So it was on April the 29th, 1905, Miss Burstall and Caroline Quanyu and 4 other members of staff, they set sail for Dublin and were awarded their degrees at Trinity. And that's why we have a graduation photo of Sarah Burstall in a cap and gown taken on that occasion, even though she went to Cambridge.
And it really, thinking about 150 years, it really brings home to you how important Manchester High was in promoting the cause of a university education for women.
Yeah, because without schools such as ours, the men had every excuse not to let us in.
What a good place to end. Pam and Gwen, you're just incredible. Thank you so much. And I think your passion for the archive just continues to inspire us. Thank you for your knowledge, your enthusiasm, for your willingness to share stories in the history of our great school. And thank you for being with us. It's fantastic just to listen. We could listen to you all evening. Thank you so much. And yeah, it's been fabulous. And thank you to everybody who's been with us this evening. It's been lovely just to see all these comments coming up through the chat and some fantastic questions. And I hope everybody that you've enjoyed our 150th birthday in conversation with the Archivists. And I really hope that we can see you at other birthday events over the course of 2024, because, you know, as you know, our 150th birthday year presents an amazing opportunity for us to celebrate this amazing milestone with our community of students, parents, alumni and staff, remembering this brilliant past that we've heard so much about this evening, celebrating the past and also imagining our future. And we do hope to see